The first thing I smelled was burning silk. For half a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the ivory garment bag collapsing into my parents' fire pit, orange flames climbing over the dress I had paid $4,200 for with my own money. Mom! I took one step forward, but the heat pushed me back. The satin along the skirt had already darkened and curled. A line of tiny covered buttons I had spent 20 minutes admiring at my final fitting disappeared beneath a burst of flame. My mother didn't move. Neither did my father. Susan stood on the other side of the fire with her arms folded over her chest, her face tight in that familiar expression she used whenever she had decided anger was actually concern. "Your sister can't even have the life she wanted," she said, "and you're still determined to parade your happiness in front of her." I stared at her. My father shook his head. "Can't you suffer with Emily for once?" I was 41 years old. An occupational therapist and hospital discharge coordinator. I spent my workdays asking questions most families wanted to skip. Who was actually available after discharge? Who had agreed to help with bathing, transfers, medication reminders, meals? Who was merely being volunteered because everyone assumed the responsible daughter would figure it out? At work, I never built a safe plan around a person who hadn't said yes. Inside my own family, apparently nobody had ever considered asking. My hands were shaking, but I took out my phone. I photographed the fire pit, the ruined garment bag, the receipt folder I had brought with me because I had planned to pick up my veil and shoes at the same time, and what remained of my wedding dress. My mother's mouth tightened. "Oh, don't be dramatic." I looked at her over the flames. "The wedding is still happening." That changed her expression. Not the ruined dress. Not my shaking hands. Not the fact that she had just destroyed something I had bought with months of careful saving. The word no. My father stepped toward me. "Natalie, nobody is saying you can never get married." "Dad, she just burned my wedding dress." "You know how your mother gets when she's worried." There it was. The sentence that had excused almost everything in our house. "You know how your mother is." As if Susan were weather. As if the rest of us were responsible for carrying umbrellas. My mother pointed toward the fire. "This could have been avoided if you'd listened. Emily has barely held herself together this year. Her surgery, the engagement falling apart, everything she lost. And that means I lose my wedding? It means you think about somebody besides yourself." I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because if I didn't, I was afraid I might start crying in front of them. And I could not bear the thought of my mother interpreting my tears as progress. I picked up my purse and the small box containing my shoes. "Behind me," Susan said. "We already rearranged things for the next few weeks. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." At the time, I thought she meant family plans, flowers, reservations, the relatives she had already called to complain about me. 48 hours later, I learned she meant my life. But to understand why that sentence should have frightened me immediately, I have to go back a few days. I worked at a hospital on the east side of Portland, far enough from my parents' neighborhood that they rarely visited and, more importantly, separate from the orthopedic facility where my father was scheduled to have his hip replaced. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting across from a woman named Melissa, whose 78-year-old father was preparing to discharge after a fall. Her brother kept answering every question for her. "Melissa can stay with him," he told me. Melissa looked at the floor. "For how long?" I asked. Her brother frowned as if the answer were obvious. "However long Dad needs." I looked at Melissa. "Is that what you agreed to?" She hesitated. "I can do Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I have 2 kids at home and I work mornings." Her brother leaned back. "Well, someone has to do it." "Correct," I said. "Which is why we need a plan based on who is actually available." Afterward, Dana Ruiz, one of our senior discharge planners, stood beside me at the printer while I revised the home support section. "Family does that all the time," she said. "Volunteers somebody who isn't in the room? Usually the daughter who looks the most competent." I smiled without much humor. "That specific?" Dana lifted one shoulder. "Reliable isn't the same as available." I remember the sentence because I wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it beside my monitor. I thought it was about work. It wasn't. For years, my family had called me the strong one, the practical one, the one who handled things. Those words sounded like compliments until you noticed they were always followed by a request. Emily, my younger sister, had always been different. She was 36 and had once been the bright, social center of every room she entered. She remembered birthdays. She made elaborate playlists for road trips. She could talk to strangers in grocery store lines and leave knowing where they went to college. Then the year before my wedding, she had undergone major surgery. The outcome changed the future she thought she was going to have. A few months later, her fiancé ended their engagement. He didn't disappear cruelly in the middle of the night. There was no dramatic betrayal for my mother to hate him for. He simply admitted that grief had changed both of them and that neither of them knew how to keep pretending otherwise. That almost made it worse. There was nobody convenient to blame. So my mother blamed the world. And then, slowly, she began reorganizing the rest of us around Emily's pain. The first time I noticed it, Mark and I were supposed to spend a weekend at the coast. We had booked a small place near Cannon Beach months earlier. Friday afternoon, as I was shutting down my computer, Mom called. "Emily has a follow-up Monday." "Okay. She's anxious." "I'm sure she is." Silence. That was my cue. I knew it before she said anything. "Natalie, could you come back Sunday night and take her?" "Mom, you can take her. I have your father." Dad was perfectly capable of spending 3 hours alone. But the sentence meant something else. "I have your father. You have Emily." The coast trip ended a day early. Emily thanked me in the car on the way to the appointment. She never said she had asked me to go. I didn't ask. A few months later, Mark proposed. We took photographs in Washington Park beneath trees that had just started turning. I sent my parents one before posting anything online. My mother called within 5 minutes. "Maybe don't put those up yet." "Why?" "Emily is having a hard week." I stared at the photo on my phone. Mark was laughing because I had almost dropped the ring box while pretending to pose normally. It was one of the happiest pictures anyone had ever taken of me. "How long is yet? Why does everything need a deadline with you?" I waited 11 days. Emily never asked me to. Then came the bridal shower. I had originally wanted one long table at a small restaurant with about 20 women. My mother suggested fewer guests. Then less wedding talk. Then maybe no games involving marriage? Emily doesn't need to sit through 3 hours of everyone talking about brides. Eventually, the shower became brunch with 8 people. I told myself I preferred it that way. That was another skill I had developed. Turning what I was allowed to have into what I claimed I had wanted. Emily was not entirely passive in all of this. She accepted the attention. She let Mom cancel things for her. She stopped calling some friends back. When an old college friend suggested a support group, Mom dismissed it before Emily could even answer. "You don't need strangers filling your head with horror stories," she said. Emily looked tired. "Maybe later." Later never came. Mom began saying, "We've got it covered," whenever anyone offered help. By we, she mostly meant herself and me. Emily moved back into my parents' house after the breakup. Her world became smaller. And because her world was smaller, mine was expected to shrink in proportion. My mother had a sentence for that too. "The one who has more should carry more." She said it like scripture. I had a steady job. A fiancé who loved me. Savings. A home. Therefore, apparently, every good thing in my life created a debt. The cruel part was that the system had not begun with Emily. It had begun 6 years earlier with Dad. He'd had a health scare that led to a long stretch of appointments, medication changes, and follow-up testing. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough moving pieces to overwhelm my mother. At the time, I stepped in willingly. I made a spreadsheet. I put his medications in one list. I coordinated appointments. I called insurance after work. I attended a couple of consultations so my parents wouldn't have to remember everything. Mom kissed my cheek one night and said, "Thank God for our strong one." I remember how warm that made me feel. Ridiculous, maybe. I was 35. I had a career. Friends. My own apartment. Yet some part of me still lit up when my mother said she needed me. A few weeks later, she called while I was at work. "I moved your father's appointment to Thursday." "I'm working Thursday. I already told the clinic you'd handle it." I should have corrected her then. Instead, I laughed. "You could have asked. I knew you'd figure it out." And I did. I traded shifts. I went. Nothing terrible happened. Which meant my mother learned exactly the wrong lesson. Tell Natalie first. Ask later. She'll make it work. By the time she burned my wedding dress, that pattern had been running for 6 years. I just hadn't understood that silence could become precedent. Mark was waiting for me when I left my parents' house that night. I had called him from the car, but I hadn't told him much. When I arrived at his place, he opened the door and stopped. What happened? I held up the shoebox. That's what survived. He didn't ask whether my mother had really done it. He knew me well enough not to make me prove pain before he believed it. He just stepped aside and let me in. I showed him the photographs. The fire. The blackened fabric. The receipt. 4,200 He stared at the screen for a long moment. What do you want to do? Not, here's what we're going to do. Not, I'll handle it. Just the question. I sat down at his kitchen table. I'm still getting married. That part I assumed. I looked at him. You assumed? He winced. Bad word choice. Despite everything, I laughed. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I needed them. The next day, we began looking for another dress. Not a better one. Not a more expensive one. Just something I could choose without my mother's hands anywhere near it. 48 hours after the fire, I was sitting beside Mark with 3 browser tabs open when my phone started ringing. Mom. I let it go. She called again. Then again. By the 7th call, Mark looked at me. You want me to turn it off? No. That mattered. I didn't want him protecting me from my family by becoming another person who decided for me. By the 11th call, I finally picked up. What? Natalie? Thank God. Mom's breathing was fast. Your father's post-op arrangements are a mess. Dad's hip replacement was scheduled for the following month. He would likely need help with walking, showering, meals, and transportation for at least the first week or so. We had discussed it generally. We had never agreed that I would provide all of it. What happened to the agency? They don't have the weekend coverage anymore. Why not? That's not important right now. It's very important if you're asking me to replace it. Her voice sharpened. Natalie, forget about the dress for 5 minutes. Your father needs you. I closed the laptop. What exactly are you asking me to do? There was a pause. Then she said the sentence that changed the direction of the entire story. I already told them you were coming back. My fingers tightened around the phone. Told who? The care people. What did you tell them? That you'd be available after his surgery. I never said that. Oh, for heaven's sake, you always help your father. That is not the same thing. You're making everything sound like a contract. Maybe it was because of what I did for a living. Maybe it was Dana's sticky note still sitting beside my monitor. Reliable isn't the same as available. But suddenly, my mother's wording felt wrong in a way I could no longer ignore. Send me the agency name and the schedule. What? Email me exactly what was arranged and what changed. Why? Because I'm not agreeing to anything until I know what you already agreed to for me. She went quiet. Then came the familiar attack. This is what your wedding is doing to you. You're becoming selfish. I almost answered, almost defended myself. Instead, I said, send the information. Then I hung up. Mark had heard only my side. He didn't ask for hers. You going over there? I stared at the phone. Every muscle in my body said yes. Drive over. Fix it. Make sure Dad is safe. Stop Mom from escalating. Return everyone to neutral. It was a reflex so old it barely felt like a choice. No, I said. The word sounded small, then stronger. Not until I know what she did. I opened a blank document on my laptop. At the top, I typed, date, request, who asked, what I agreed to. It looked ridiculous, like I was auditing my own family. But for the first time, I needed facts more than reassurance. 20 minutes later, an email arrived from Mom. No message, just a forwarded chain from the home care agency. I scrolled past scheduling notes until one line stopped me. Weekend coverage declined by family. Daughter to resume care following discharge. I read it twice. Then I looked at the date. 3 days before my wedding dress went into the fire. 3 days before my mother had demanded I postpone the wedding. 3 days before she had told me I needed to suffer with my sister. My parents hadn't simply hoped I would give in. They had already begun rearranging my life around the assumption that I would. And for the first time in 6 years, I didn't ask myself how I was going to make it work. I asked a different question. How many times had they said yes for me before I even knew I'd been asked? How many times had they said yes for me before I even knew I'd been asked? The question stayed with me through breakfast the next morning. It followed me into the shower. It sat beside me in traffic. By the time I reached my office, the forwarded email from the care agency had already been opened 6 times on my phone. Weekend coverage declined by family. Daughter to resume care following discharge. Nothing about that sentence was dramatic. No accusation. No threat. No raised voice. That was what bothered me most. Somebody had typed it as routine information. A fact. My availability had become a fact before it had ever become a conversation. At my desk, I opened the document I had started the night before. Date. Request. Who asked. What I agreed to. The first few entries came easily. Dad's cardiology follow-up 3 years ago. Mom had called. Emily's post-op appointment 8 months ago. Mom had called. The weekend trip Mark and I cut short. Mom again. The engagement photographs I had delayed posting. Mom. Bridal shower plans changed. Mom. There were direct requests mixed in, of course. Dad had called me himself when he couldn't understand a medication change. Emily had once asked whether I could sit with her after a difficult appointment because she didn't want to be alone. Those memories mattered. I didn't want to rewrite the past just because I was angry now. But as the list grew, something became impossible to ignore. Most of the sacrifices I remembered as choices had begun with someone else telling me what another person needed. By 9:30, the page had become uncomfortable enough that I minimized it when Dana stopped beside my desk. You look like you're preparing a federal case. It's worse. She raised an eyebrow. My mother. That bad? Possibly. Dana had known about the dress because I had texted her the morning after it happened. Her response had been 6 words. Please tell me you photographed everything. I had. Now she glanced at the spreadsheet on my monitor. What's that? A bad idea. Those are usually the interesting ones. After a second, I turned the screen slightly toward her. There were no medical records on it, no protected information, just my own calendar entries, text message dates, and memories I could verify from my phone. I'm trying to figure out how often somebody actually asked me for the things I gave them. Dana read the column headings. Then she pointed to who asked. That one seems important. It is becoming important. She pulled the spare chair closer, but didn't touch my keyboard. How many of these came directly from the person who needed help? My eyes went down the page. That's what I'm trying to determine. Dana waited. Maybe she knew the answer was already there. Maybe she was simply giving me room to say it. Not many. How many? Almost none of the recent ones. The words sounded ugly once they were spoken. 6 years of being the reliable daughter. Almost no direct asks. Dana leaned back. That doesn't mean nobody needed you. I know. It also doesn't mean you agreed to everything just because you eventually did it. That sentence hit harder than I expected. There was a difference between consent and compliance. At work, I understood it perfectly. At home, I had treated the two as interchangeable. The next name on my list was Emily's. For 20 minutes, her contact sat open on my phone while I found reasons not to press call. She had been through something devastating. That remained true no matter what Mom had done. Her surgery had changed the future she expected. Her engagement had ended. Her confidence had collapsed. None of that became less real because my mother had weaponized it. But neither did my life become less real because Emily was hurting. Finally, during my lunch break, I called. She answered on the 4th ring. Hey, do you have a minute? A pause. Mom said you're being weird about Dad's surgery. Of course she had. What did Mom tell you? That you're refusing to help because of the dress. That's not what I asked. Another pause. What do you want, Natalie? I need to ask you about a few things. Her breathing changed slightly. Not fear, guardedness. All right. Last spring, when Mark and I came back early from the coast so I could take you to your follow-up, did you ask Mom to call me? No. The answer came so quickly that my hand stopped over the notebook. Did you ask me to come back? No. I thought you were already home. For a second, the office around me seemed to lose focus. Emily. What? Mom told me you were scared to go alone. I was scared. That isn't what I asked. She exhaled. No, I didn't ask you. I wrote it down. My own handwriting looked too neat for what it meant. What about the engagement pictures? What about them? Did you ask Mom to tell me not to post them? Silence. No. Did seeing them upset you? Yes. That answer mattered too. Emily continued before I could speak. I had just lost everything, Natalie. You knew that. I knew you were hurting. Then why are you talking like Mom invented it? I'm not. My voice stayed low because anger would have made it easier for both of us to avoid the question. I'm asking whether you asked me to change my life around it. She didn't answer. A printer started somewhere behind me. The ordinary noise made the conversation feel stranger. Finally, Emily said, Mom was trying to protect me from seeing me happy. That's not fair. Was I supposed to stop being happy? I didn't say that. Exactly. The word hung there. For the first time, I heard the distinction clearly. Emily had suffered. Mom had translated that suffering into instructions for me. And I had obeyed without checking whether the translation was accurate. There was one more thing I needed to know. Did you ever go to that support group Claire told you about? Emily made a small sound of irritation. No. Why? Mom said it would make things worse. What did you think? I don't know. By then, I was tired of everybody having opinions. Did you talk to Claire again? No. Mom had said we had it covered. I remembered the phrase, we, meaning Mom deciding, me doing, Emily, receiving. Nobody outside the loop getting close enough to change it. Emily's voice sharpened. Why are you interrogating me? I'm not. It feels like it. Then I'll make it simple. From now on, if you need something from me, ask me yourself. She gave a humorless laugh. So now I need an appointment to talk to my sister? No, you need to talk to your sister if you want something from your sister. That sounds like the same thing. It isn't. The line went quiet. Then she said something I hadn't expected. It was easier letting Mom handle things. There it was. Not innocence. Not malice. Convenience. Easier for you, I said. Expensive for me. She hung up. For the next hour, guilt tried to persuade me I had been cruel. Then the facts began pushing back. Emily had not created the entire system, but she had benefited from it. And when benefiting was easier than asking questions, she had chosen easy. That mattered. By late afternoon, one question had replaced all the others. If Mom had been speaking for Emily, had she been doing the same thing with Dad? I called him after work. He answered from his recliner, television playing somewhere behind him. Everything all right? I wanted to ask about your hip surgery. A tired sigh came through the phone. Your mother said you two are fighting about that now too. We're not fighting about your surgery. That's not what she says. Dad, after the operation, do you want me to be your full-time caregiver for the first week? The television volume lowered. Your mother handles the schedule. That wasn't my question. Natalie, did you ask me to do it? He hesitated. Then came the sentence he had used in different forms my entire life. You know how your mother is. She gets worked up because she worries about Emily. That still isn't an answer. She's trying to keep everything from falling apart. Did you ask me? Another sigh. I assumed you'd help. How much? You know, getting around, meals, maybe showers the first few days, driving me to therapy. That's not a couple of errands. You work in healthcare. The words landed with a weight I recognized. Capability, used as obligation. I work in healthcare for a hospital, I said. That doesn't make me automatically available at home. You always do these things. There it was again. Always. Such a small word. Such an efficient way to erase every separate decision that had come before it. Did you know Mom was telling people I had already agreed? He didn't answer immediately. You're getting too caught up in wording. No. I'm asking whether you knew. She was trying to keep everything from falling apart. The same defense. Mom's anxiety became intent. Intent became necessity. Necessity became my responsibility. Dad. What? Next time you need something from me, you ask me. That's ridiculous. We're your parents. Then asking me should be easy. He muttered something I couldn't make out. The call ended a minute later without resolution. That used to bother me. I wanted conversations tied into neat bows. I wanted people to understand before I moved forward. That evening, for once, I moved forward without being understood. Mom called around 6 asking me to reschedule Dad's pre-op physical therapy appointment. "What's wrong with the current time?" I asked. "It conflicts with something." "What?" "My errands." "Does Dad want the appointment moved?" "Why does that matter?" "Because it's his appointment." Her tone hardened. "Natalie, just call them. They know you." "They don't know me. It's not my hospital." "You know what I mean. Text me exactly what Dad needs and why." "You're making families so formal." "I'm asking for information. I don't have time for this." "Then I'm not changing it." She hung up. My hand hovered over the phone. The old version of me would have called Dad, then the clinic, then Mom, then solved the conflict nobody had asked me to solve. Instead, I put the phone face down and left for my dress fitting. Mark was already waiting outside the shop. He glanced at my expression. "Do I need to hate someone?" "Not tonight." "Excellent. I'm off duty." The replacement dress was simpler than the first one. No long train. No covered buttons. The fabric felt lighter against my skin. When the consultant pinned the hem, I looked at myself in the mirror and expected to see what had been lost. Instead, for the first time all week, I saw the wedding still coming. Mom called twice while I stood on the platform. I didn't answer. Afterward, Mark and I went to dinner. My phone stayed face down for 90 minutes. When I finally checked it, there was a text from Dad. "Your mother changed the appointment. All handled." Nothing had collapsed. Nobody had missed medical care. Mom had simply done the task herself because I hadn't stepped in quickly enough to make her unnecessary. That realization was almost embarrassing. Some of the emergencies I had spent years preventing had never been emergencies. They were chores other people preferred not to do. The next afternoon, my phone rang while I was finishing documentation at work. The number was unfamiliar but local. "Is this Natalie Brooks?" "Yes. My name is Lauren. I'm calling from the orthopedic center about Richard Brooks's discharge planning. Your number was listed as the primary family contact." My back straightened. Dad had signed the necessary permission for me to participate in planning weeks earlier, when we had discussed his surgery in general terms. Being a family contact was not unusual. What came next was, "I'm calling to confirm your availability for the initial post-operative period," Lauren said. "Your mother indicated you would be providing primary assistance at home." I looked at the sticky note beside my monitor. "Reliable isn't the same as available." "I think there's been a mistake," I said. Lauren paused. "All right. I never agreed to be the primary caregiver." Another pause, shorter this time. "Let me check the planning notes." Keys clicked faintly on her end. I didn't ask her to read me Dad's chart. I didn't need his clinical details. I needed one answer about myself. Lauren came back on the line. "I have a note that says family caregiver confirmed." "Who gave that confirmation?" "Your mother." "And what exactly did she say?" "That you had already agreed to provide care after discharge." There it was. Not implied. Not misunderstood. Already agreed. When was that entered? She gave me the date. 3 days before the dress burned. My throat tightened, but my voice stayed steady. "I need the record to reflect that I dispute that confirmation." I did not agree. "Yes, I can document that. I'd also like a care conference before the surgery, so Dad has an actual plan that doesn't depend on an unconfirmed caregiver." "That's reasonable. Can you send the family the available post-op support options?" "We can go over those at the conference and send the standard information." "Thank you." Before hanging up, Lauren said, "Just so I'm clear, are you saying you won't be involved at all?" "No. That distinction mattered. I'm saying nobody gets to decide what my involvement is before asking me." After the call, I stayed in my chair for several minutes. No triumph came. Mostly grief. My mother had taken something I had always considered generous and turned it into standing permission. And Dad had been comfortable enough with the arrangement not to ask questions. That night, I dealt with the dress. Not because it was the biggest issue anymore. Because it was still an issue. The original receipt showed $4,200. I scanned it, added the order confirmation, attached 3 photographs from the fire pit. Then I wrote an email to Mom. Mom, the wedding dress you destroyed belonged to me and was purchased entirely with my own money. The original cost was $4,200. I've attached the receipt, order confirmation, and photographs showing the damage. I'm requesting reimbursement of $4,200 within 30 days. This is separate from Dad's care arrangements and separate from whether you attend my wedding. Natalie, no threat, no bargaining, no promise that repayment would restore access to me, just the cost of what she had destroyed. Her reply arrived 14 minutes later. You're invoicing your own mother? I read it once, then archived it. Mark, sitting across the table, watched me close the laptop. You're not answering? No. That's new. Yes. He reached for his coffee. After a moment he asked, if she refuses to pay, what will you do? I'll decide then. You're not just letting it go. No. The answer came easier than it would have a week earlier. If I let her call it nothing, she gets to rewrite it as nothing. 2 days later, an email from the orthopedic center appeared in my inbox. Care conference invitation. Dad had agreed for me to attend. I opened the draft agenda. Medication review. Mobility expectations. Home environment. Post-operative support. Then one line near the bottom. Primary caregiver. Natalie Brooks disputed. Pending confirmation. I stared at the word disputed. For most people, it would have looked bureaucratic. To me, it looked like the first crack in a system that had always depended on nobody asking whether I had actually said yes. The word disputed stayed with me for the rest of the week. Not because it sounded hostile, because it was the first time anything connected to my parents had officially acknowledged that their version of my consent might not be the same as mine. For years, the pattern had been almost invisible because nothing had ever been written down. Mom called. Dad assumed. Emily accepted. I rearranged my calendar. Then everybody remembered the rearrangement and forgot the asking. The care conference was scheduled for the following Thursday. That gave me 8 days. My first instinct was to spend every one of them preparing. Lists, questions, transportation options, home equipment, meal schedules, physical therapy appointments. By the time I caught myself, I had already opened a blank spreadsheet. The irony was almost funny. I was trying to escape being the person who handled everything by handling everything more efficiently. Before I could build another color-coded system around Dad's hip replacement, I closed the file. There was something else I needed to understand first. Why had Mom become so convinced that suffering created obligation? The question led me to my Aunt Karen. Karen was Mom's older sister. We weren't especially close, but she had always been the relative who remembered events differently from Mom, without turning every disagreement into a war. I called her on Sunday afternoon. Did Mom ever have to take care of Grandma when she was young? I asked. Karen gave a short laugh. Have to? That sounds like a yes. Your mother lost almost an entire semester of college. I sat straighter. She never told me that. She wouldn't. Karen explained only what she had personally witnessed. Their mother had gotten sick during Susan's sophomore year. Karen was already married and living several hours away. Their father worked long shifts. Susan was the one still close enough to help. At first it was groceries, then rides, then meals, then staying overnight. She tried to keep taking classes, Karen said, for maybe 6 weeks. What happened? She started missing too much. Karen paused. I remember her standing in the kitchen one night saying, "No one even asked me. Everybody just decided I'd do it." My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. The sentence sounded too familiar. What did Grandma say? That she was grateful. That's all? What were people supposed to say in those days? Your mother was the daughter who was there. There it was again. The daughter who was there. Availability turned into destiny. Karen continued. Susan was angry about it for years. She used to say she'd never make her own daughters feel trapped like that. The room seemed very quiet around me. Apparently, she changed her mind. Karen sighed. I'm not defending her, Natalie. I know. She may not even see the connection. That was possible. I couldn't know what Mom saw when she looked at her own past. But I knew what she had done with mine. The woman who once said no one even asked me had grown into the mother who no longer believed asking me was necessary. Understanding that did not make the burned dress smaller. It did not return the weekends. It did not turn assumption into consent. If anything, it made the pattern sadder. Pain had not taught my mother to stop volunteering daughters. It had taught her that volunteering daughters was what women did. That evening, Dad called. Not Mom. Dad. The distinction mattered enough that I answered immediately. Hey, your aunt called your mother. Of course she had. What did Karen say? That you're digging through ancient history. I asked one question. You know how your mother is. There it was. Again, I leaned against the kitchen counter. Dad, I need you to stop saying that like it ends the conversation. What do you want me to say? The truth would be useful. He went quiet. Then he said, your mother gets worked up because she worries about Emily. She's been under a lot of pressure. That explains why she gets worked up. It doesn't explain why everybody else has to obey her when she does. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. She burned my wedding dress. I know. You stood there. A breath came through the phone. You were both angry. No, Mom was angry. I was standing beside a fire watching $4,200 of my property burn. Natalie, and you told me to suffer with Emily. His voice lowered. I shouldn't have said that. It was the first acknowledgement I had gotten from him that night. I let it sit there. Then I asked the question I had been waiting to ask in person but no longer wanted to postpone. Did you know Mom had been volunteering me for things before asking me? Sometimes. The answer was so simple that my stomach tightened. Sometimes? She would say you could handle something. And you knew she hadn't asked me. I didn't always know. That isn't what I asked. Dad exhaled. You know how your mother is. She only gets like that because she's scared for Emily. For years, that sentence had worked like a trap door. The moment he said Mom was worried, the discussion was supposed to end. Concern became immunity. This time it didn't. That explains why she does it, I said. Why did you let her do it with my time? He didn't answer right away. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the faint television in the background. Finally, he said, because you always made it work. There was no accusation in his voice. That made it worse. It was almost matter of fact. He had known enough to notice. He had simply benefited enough not to interfere. My father had not been trapped between three difficult women. He had been standing beside a system that made his life easier. Sometimes, he even helped hold it up. From now on, I said, if you want something from me, you ask me yourself. You're really going to make me call you for every little thing? Yes, I'm your father. And I'm your daughter, not your standing appointment, he muttered. This is ridiculous. Then it should be easy to prove me wrong. Ask. The conversation ended without warmth. For about 10 minutes afterward, guilt crawled around inside me. Then another feeling replaced it. Relief. Not because Dad had apologized. He hadn't. Because the excuse was finally gone. He knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every request. But enough. That changed what I was willing to carry for him. The next morning, I started looking at Dad's recovery options. Carefully. Not because I had decided to take over. Because I wanted to walk into the conference knowing that saying no to unpaid full-time care did not mean saying no to his safety. Hip replacement recovery was familiar territory in my work. Mobility. Transfers. Bathing. Medication reminders. Meal access. Transportation to therapy. The first few days mattered, but people managed them in more than one way. I called 2 local home care agencies as a prospective family member and asked about standard private pay blocks. Then I reviewed the orthopedic center's general discharge information they had already sent the family. Short-term rehabilitation was one possibility if Dad was not safe enough to go directly home. Home health combined with paid aid support was another. I wrote down questions instead of answers. That difference became important. By lunchtime, my notebook was filling quickly. Dana spotted it while we were eating in the staff lounge. You're doing the thing again. What thing? She pointed her fork at the notebook. The thing where you save everyone so efficiently they never have to notice you're saving them. I looked down. I had written possible aid schedules for the entire first week. Morning coverage. Evening coverage. Transportation. Meal preparation. I'm researching. You're scheduling. That's different. Not from here. I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked again. She was right. 3 agencies had become columns. Columns had become proposed hours. Proposed hours were about 2 minutes away from becoming calls I would make on Dad's behalf. The boundary I was building could easily become another form of overfunctioning. What should I bring to the conference? I asked. Dana shrugged. You know the answer. I want to hear myself say it. Options, questions, what you are and aren't offering. Not a completed plan. Unless your father hired you as his discharge coordinator. He did not. Then stop auditioning. I laughed. It loosened something in my chest. That afternoon, I deleted half the spreadsheet. 2 options remained. Short-term rehab if Dad's mobility required it. Paid home support if he was safe to return home. I sent Dad and Mom the agency names and the orthopedic center's general information. Then I wrote one sentence beneath it. You will need to contact the providers yourselves for pricing, availability, and coverage details. Mom replied almost immediately. Why are you refusing to make the calls when you know how? My thumb hovered above the keyboard. The old response would have been an explanation. Workload, wedding, honeymoon, professional boundaries. I typed something shorter. Because this is your care plan, not mine. Then I put the phone away. The next test came 2 days later. Emily called me directly. That alone made me answer differently. Hey, do you have plans Wednesday afternoon? Yes. She paused. I have my follow-up. I waited. Mom would have filled that silence. She would have explained the anxiety, reminded me of the surgery, mentioned everything Emily had lost. Emily had to say the next part herself. I don't really want to go alone. Okay, could you come? There it was. A real request. And somehow, that made saying no both easier and harder. Wednesday afternoon was my final fitting. After the fire, the bridal shop had worked hard to get the replacement dress ready on schedule. Moving the appointment would mean taking whatever opening they could find the following week. My first thought was that a medical appointment was more important than a dress fitting. The second thought was more honest. This was exactly how the pattern survived. Everything in my life became optional the moment somebody else wanted the same piece of time. I can't Wednesday afternoon, I said. Emily went quiet. My fitting is then. Oh, I can call you afterward. That's okay. Her tone changed just enough to make guilt flare again. Then she added, I'll ask someone else. I almost volunteered to move the fitting. The words were already forming. Instead, I asked, what about Claire? Claire? The friend who told you about the support group. Mom said she has enough going on. Did Claire say that? Another pause. No. There it was again. Proxy information. Not a lie I could prove. But not a direct answer either. You could ask her. Emily sounded uncertain. I haven't talked to her much. You can still ask. What if she says no? Then you'll know. That sentence was as much for me as for her. Later that evening, Emily texted. Claire said yes. Nothing else. No revelation. No apology. No declaration of independence. Just 3 words. But those 3 words meant Emily had contacted someone outside the closed circuit Mom had built around her. Not because she had suddenly transformed. Because I had finally stopped filling the space before she had to find another option. Wednesday afternoon. I kept my fitting. The seamstress adjusted the waist. The hem came up half an inch. A loose thread near the shoulder disappeared beneath careful fingers. Standing on the platform, I looked at myself in the mirror. This dress was different from the first. Less ornate. Lighter. I had expected that to feel like losing twice. Instead, it felt like proof that destruction had not earned Mom control over what came next. Afterward, Mark and I walked along the river before dinner. We talked about the honeymoon. A small hotel on the coast. 2 nights with no parents. No appointments. No calls to insurance. No checking whether Emily was okay before deciding whether we were allowed to be happy. Saturday was still open on my calendar. Mom had already mentioned that Dad might need someone around then, although his surgery had not even happened yet. Standing beside the water, I opened my phone. Saturday. I typed 1 word into the calendar. Unavailable. Mark glanced over. Plans? Yes. What are we doing? I don't know yet. He smiled. That's very mysterious. No, that's the point. For years, an empty space on my calendar had looked like availability. Now, it looked like mine. Mom called twice during dinner. I did not answer. When I checked later, neither message involved an emergency. The first asked whether I had contacted the home care agency. The second asked me to call her because she was trying to keep this family together. I did neither. 3 days later, Mom appeared at my door. Mark was home, but when I opened it, he took one look at her expression and asked me, "Want me nearby or invisible?" "Nearby." He nodded and went back toward the kitchen. Mom held a white envelope. For once, she didn't begin with criticism. "I brought you something." "What?" She handed it over. Inside was a check. $4,200. Exactly the amount from the receipt. For several seconds, I just looked at it. "I shouldn't have burned the dress," she said. The apology was so direct that I almost missed the air, leaving my lungs. No, Emily in the first sentence. No accusation. Mom looked toward the living room. I was scared. There it was. Not an excuse yet. Just a statement. Emily has barely gotten through this year. Every time something reminds her of what she lost, she falls apart again. That isn't my fault. I know. Those 2 words hurt more than I expected. Because they were what I had wanted. Recognition. Not even praise. Just acknowledgement that my happiness was not an attack. Mom continued. "I shouldn't have touched your dress. You paid for it." I was angry, and I crossed a line. My fingers closed around the check. For one dangerous moment, I wanted the story to end there. Mom understood. She had apologized. She had paid. Maybe the care conference would go smoothly. Maybe we could still have wedding photographs with everyone smiling. Maybe the empty chair in my imagination could disappear. Then she said, "After the honeymoon, you can take weekends again until your father stabilizes." The room changed. Not dramatically. No music. No raised voice. Just the return of a familiar mechanism. Apology. Then access. Accountability. Then labor. I looked down at the check. What? It would only be temporary. We haven't even had the care conference. You know what he'll need. That isn't what I asked. Mom rubbed her forehead. Please don't start with that language again. What language? Consent. Confirmation. Everything has to sound official now. It only sounds official because you keep making commitments for me. I just apologized to you. Yes. And I paid for the dress. Yes. What more do you want? There it was. The check was no longer reimbursement. She was turning it into proof that the account between us should now be balanced. I placed it on the entry table. Paying for what you destroyed doesn't buy my Saturdays. Mom stared at me. I am not buying anything. Then the 2 issues stay separate. I'm your mother. And that check is reimbursement for my property. You're unbelievable. No, I'm being very specific. Her face tightened. Your father will need help. He will have help. From strangers? From people hired to provide it, if that's the plan he chooses. You could do it better. There it was. The trap hidden inside the compliment. Capability as duty. I probably could. Mom looked briefly relieved. Then I finished. That doesn't mean I'm agreeing to. The relief disappeared. She reached toward the check. For a second, I thought she meant to take it back. I put my hand over the envelope. If you're paying for the dress, leave it. If this money depends on me taking weekends, take it. She froze. The choice was hers now, not mine. Mom pulled her hand back. The check remained on the table. Nothing was repaired between us. But something had been separated. The dress belonged to one account. My time belonged to another. She left without hugging me. After the door closed, Mark came out of the kitchen. You okay? No. He nodded. Want coffee? Yes. That was all. He did not tell me I had won. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally discovering how expensive a real boundary could be. The next morning, an email from the orthopedic center arrived. The subject line read, Care Conference Agenda. Dad had confirmed attendance. So had Mom. I opened the document. Mobility assessment. Home equipment. Medication support. Transportation. Post-operative destination. Then the final item. Confirm caregiver plan. My pulse picked up. Mom's email came 2 minutes later. This is what daughters do, Natalie. I hope you remember that before Thursday. For once, I didn't answer her doctrine with a paragraph. I replied, with 2 sentences. I will participate in Dad's care planning. I am not consenting to be his primary caregiver. Then I opened my calendar. Thursday morning was the care conference. Saturday still said unavailable. For the first time, I understood that both entries belonged there. Thursday morning arrived with rain against the kitchen windows and 3 pages on my table. That was all I took. Not 6 years of calendars. Not screenshots of every time Mom had called me selfish. Not photographs of the burned dress. The dress had its own account now. The check had cleared the day before. $4,200 had returned to me, but the money had not repaired anything beyond the thing money could actually repair. For Dad's care conference, I carried only what mattered. The email Mom had forwarded showing that weekend coverage had been declined. A short written statement saying I had never agreed to be Dad's primary caregiver after surgery. And a comparison of 2 workable alternatives that did not require me to move into my parents' house for 10 days. Mark stood near the front door while I put the papers into a thin folder. Want me to come? No. He nodded once. Want me to drive? That would help. 10 minutes later, we were in the car. He didn't rehearse arguments with me. Didn't tell me what I should say. At a red light, he reached across the console and squeezed my hand. When we reached the orthopedic center, I looked at the entrance and felt the old reflex return. Go in. Fix everything. Make Dad safe. Make Mom calm. Make the meeting easy. Make everyone leave believing Natalie had once again handled it. The reflex was so familiar that for a moment it felt like morality. Then Dana's voice came back to me. Are you building options? Or are you quietly becoming the coordinator again? I closed the folder. I'll call you when I'm done. Mark smiled. I'll be around. Then he drove away. That mattered more than if he had marched inside beside me. This was the first room I had entered with my parents, where I did not intend to leave, carrying whatever nobody else wanted. The conference room was smaller than I expected. Dad sat near the window with a cane beside his chair. He had not had the surgery yet, but his hip had gotten bad enough that standing from low furniture took effort. Mom sat next to him. Across the table were Lauren, the discharge planner who had called me, and a social worker named Patrice. I knew their roles. I also knew they were not there to judge my childhood. That was useful. Mom looked at my folder. You brought paperwork? Yes. She gave Dad a look. He rubbed one hand over his knee. Lauren began the meeting. We're here to make sure Richard has a safe plan after his hip replacement. The goal today is to clarify what support is available and what still needs to be arranged. Mom jumped in before Lauren reached the next sentence. Natalie knows all of this. Lauren looked at her. Mom gestured toward me. She's an occupational therapist. She does discharge planning herself. She knows exactly what he'll need. That's helpful background, Lauren said. But we still need to confirm the actual plan. We have a plan. Mom leaned forward. Natalie has always helped her father. She knows the house. She knows his medications. She knows how to help him shower without making him feel helpless. My stomach tightened. That last detail was exactly the kind of thing that had made it hard to say no. She wasn't inventing my competence. She was using something true. That was what made the trap effective. Mom continued. She's under a lot of wedding stress right now, and there's been some conflict at home, but that shouldn't interfere with Richard's recovery. Dad looked down at the table. I waited. There had been a time when I would have interrupted after the first sentence. Defended myself. Explained the dress. Explained Emily. Explained what Mom had said. That morning, I let her finish. The room did not need my entire history. It needed facts. When Mom stopped, Lauren turned to me. Natalie? I opened the folder. There are 3 things I need clarified before we go any further. Mom crossed her arms. I kept my eyes on Lauren and Dad. First, I never agreed to be Dad's primary caregiver after discharge. Mom inhaled sharply. I continued, before she could speak. Second, paid weekend coverage was declined before anyone asked me whether I was available. I placed the forwarded email on the table. Third, there are safe alternatives that do not depend on an unconfirmed caregiver. Patrice glanced at the paper. Lauren looked at Mom. The note we received indicated Natalie had already agreed. She always helps, Mom said. That isn't the same as agreeing to this specific plan, I said. Mom turned toward me. Natalie, please. My voice stayed level. I'm not discussing whether I love Dad. That's exactly what this is about. No, it's about who is actually providing 10 days of hands-on care. Dad shifted in his chair. Mom looked toward him. Richard, say something. His mouth tightened. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad looked at Mom. Did Natalie actually tell you she'd do the 10 days? The room seemed to narrow. Mom stared at him. Then at me. Then back at him. She always does. There it was. 4 words. No confession. No apology. No dramatic admission that she had been controlling my life for years. Just the sentence she believed should settle everything. She always does. My entire history reduced to standing authorization. Every past yes stretched forward into the future until nobody needed to ask anymore. Lauren spoke first. For planning purposes, we do need current confirmation from the person providing care. Mom looked at her as if the sentence were absurd. I'm telling you she can do it. I answered before Lauren had to. I can. Mom's face changed slightly. For half a second, relief appeared. Then I finished. I am not agreeing to. The distinction landed differently when spoken aloud. Capability was fact. Consent was choice. They were not the same thing. Mom pushed back from the table. This is unbelievable. Dad kept his eyes on me. What happens if she doesn't? Lauren pulled the discussion back to him. That depends on how you're moving after surgery. If you're safe for discharge home, we can look at home health, combined with paid assistance for the tasks you can't manage. If you need more support with transfers and mobility, a short rehabilitation stay may be appropriate before you go home. Dad nodded slowly. What would you recommend? That decision comes after your post-operative assessment, Lauren said. We can prepare for both possibilities. Mom pointed toward me. But home would be easier if Natalie stayed. Easier for who? I asked. She looked at me. For your father. Or for everyone who doesn't have to arrange the care. Natalie. Dad's voice was tired. I turned toward him. You're going to be safe. Are you sure? Yes. That was one statement I could make without hesitation. There are safe options. I'm just not one of the automatic ones. Patrice slid a planning sheet closer to Dad. Richard, you can choose who you want involved, but each person still has to agree to the role. Dad glanced at Mom. Then at the sheet. Mom started. We don't need strangers. Dad raised a hand. It was not dramatic. He simply stopped her long enough to speak. If I need rehab for a few days, I'll do rehab. Mom stared at him. And after that? We use the home care option. But Natalie, she said no. The words did not make Dad a hero. He had waited years too long to say something so basic. Still, hearing them mattered. Not because he had rescued me. Because after I had said no repeatedly, he finally stopped pretending he had not heard it. Lauren looked at me. Do you want us to remove you as the primary caregiver and keep you listed as a family contact? Yes. She nodded. I can update that. I watched her make a note. Not on my authority. Not because I had logged into anything. Because I had sat in the room as Dad's daughter and told the truth about what I had and had not agreed to. Mom shook her head. This whole thing is humiliating. I closed the folder. I corrected a care plan. You made it sound like I lied. You told them I agreed. You always do. The sentence came again. This time it sounded weaker. Not because Mom had changed, because the room no longer treated it as proof. Lauren moved to the next item on the agenda. Walker height. Bathroom safety. Transportation. For the first time since Dad's surgery had been scheduled, the meeting continued without my availability functioning as a piece of equipment. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not when anyone yelled. Not when Mom looked angry. When the plan kept moving after my no. Afterward, Mom caught me in the hallway. Dad had stayed behind to ask Lauren something about rehabilitation coverage. Mom walked fast enough that I heard her shoes before she reached me. You embarrassed me. I turned. No. You sat in there and made me look manipulative. I told them I hadn't agreed. You could have told me privately. I did. That's different. How? Because they don't know us. That's exactly why facts work better there. Her jaw tightened. You enjoyed that? No. That answer was immediate. There was nothing enjoyable about watching my mother lose the story she had used to organize us. It hurt. It also needed to happen. Mom lowered her voice. Emily needs you this weekend too. The sentence was almost impressive in its timing. 20 minutes after the meeting. The exact mechanism, reused as if nothing had happened. What does she need? She has things going on. What things? She shouldn't have to explain every detail. Then she can ask me. Mom rolled her eyes. This again? Yes. She needs support. I pulled out my phone. What are you doing? Calling Emily. Mom's expression changed. You don't need to bother her. If she needs me, it won't be a bother. Emily answered after a few rings. Hey, Mom says you need me this weekend. Do you? There was a pause. What? Do you need me this weekend? No, I'm seeing Claire Saturday. I looked at Mom. She could hear Emily through the phone because I had turned the volume up, but I did not put the call on speaker for anyone else to perform around. Okay, I told Emily. That's all I needed. Why? Mom thought you needed something. A tired exhale came through the line. I didn't ask her to call you. Got it. We hung up. Mom stared at the floor for a moment, then at me. You didn't have to do that. I did. You're making everyone report directly to you like employees. No. I'm asking adults to speak for themselves. What if Emily is too overwhelmed? Then she can tell me that. What if your father needs something? He asks. And if I need something? You ask for yourself. Mom's eyes narrowed. So, I'm not allowed to help anybody anymore? You're allowed to help. You're not allowed to volunteer me. Her lips pressed together. If Dad needs me, Dad asks. If Emily needs me, Emily asks. You don't answer for them, and you don't answer for me. You're tearing this family apart. No. The words came out softer than hers. I'm taking my name out of decisions I didn't make. She walked away before Dad came out of the conference room. For several minutes, I stood alone near the elevator. My knees felt unsteady. The meeting had gone exactly the way I had prepared for. That didn't make the aftermath easy. Boundaries did not remove grief. They just stopped grief from deciding what happened next. Dad's surgery took place the following week. I knew only what he and the care team shared with me directly. The procedure went as planned. His mobility afterward was not quite strong enough for the center to recommend going straight home with minimal support, so he chose a short rehabilitation stay. Mom texted me the address and visiting hours. No request attached. That alone felt unfamiliar. I visited 2 evenings later. Dad was sitting in a chair beside the bed wearing sweatpants and the expression of a man deeply offended by elastic compression socks. You look fashionable, I said. Get out. You just got here. So did you. It was the closest thing to normal we had managed in weeks. A walker stood within reach. His tray held a cup of coffee and a folded sheet from the rehabilitation staff. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things, physical therapy, food, the wedding. Then he looked at me. I didn't realize your mother had actually canceled those weekend hours. I kept my voice even. She sent me the email. He nodded. I thought she was just arranging around you. Around me without me. He looked at his coffee. Yeah. No apology followed. I did not drag one out of him. Dad, this is what I mean. You can ask me for things. I'm not disappearing, but you might say no. Yes. His mouth twitched. That's going to take getting used to. For both of us. That part was true. Saying no was still work. The difference was that now the work was mine. When Dad left rehab, he went home with scheduled aid support and home health visits based on what his care team determined he needed. The parts not fully covered by insurance came to Mom and Dad as bills. Mom made sure I knew that. The first time she called about one, she said, "Do you know what these aids cost?" Yes. You could have saved us a lot. There was an old invitation hidden in the sentence. Guilt. Rescue. Return. Instead, I asked, "Do you have a question about the bill?" I'm telling you it's expensive. I know. So that doesn't bother you. It's the cost of the care Dad needs. It wouldn't cost anything if you did it. It would cost me. She said nothing. That was one of the clearest moments of the entire story. For years, my labor had been described as free because nobody had sent my parents an invoice. The cost had simply appeared somewhere else. My PTO. My weekends. My sleep. My plans with Mark. The wedding photographs I delayed. The trips I shortened. The hours after work that disappeared into phone calls. Paid care did not create a new expense. It made an old one visible. A few days later, Dad called me directly. Not Mom. Natalie? Yeah? Are you free Saturday? My eyes went to the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Saturday still, said Unavailable. Mark and I planned to finish writing our vows and pack for the honeymoon. Dad continued. I need a ride to a follow-up. Your mother has something she can't move. The old reflex showed up immediately. A medical appointment. Dad recovering from surgery. A task I could easily perform. I'm not free Saturday. There was a pause. Okay. Nothing else. No speech about daughters. No reminder of everything he had done for me. Then he said, I'll ask the agency about transportation. Okay. Another pause. Have fun with whatever you're doing. My throat tightened. Thanks, Dad. We hung up. I stood there holding the phone. 1 week earlier, saying no had required a folder, a conference, and 3 carefully prepared facts. That morning, it required 1 sentence. The system was not fixed. Mom still called. Emily still leaned on her sometimes. Dad still had moments when he acted as if my availability were the default setting. But the old machinery no longer ran automatically. Every request now hit the same obstacle. May. A person. Not a standing authorization. That evening, Mark and I sat on the bedroom floor with an open suitcase between us. He held up 2 shirts. Blue or gray? Blue. You didn't even look. Blue. He put the gray one in anyway. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mom. I let it sit. Then it buzzed again. And again. Mark glanced toward it. Need to check? No. We kept packing. 10 minutes later, curiosity won. I picked up the phone. There was a message. I won't attend a wedding where my own daughter gives me rules. My hand stayed around the phone. The room seemed to get smaller. All week, I had been preparing myself for invoices, care schedules, Dad's recovery, Mom's anger. That sentence found the one place I had not managed to reinforce. The small, stupid hope that she would still come. Mark saw my face. What happened? I showed him the screen. He read it, then handed the phone back. No judgment. No good riddance. No attempt to tell me what I should feel. What do you want to do? He asked. The same question he had asked after the dress burned. Only now the answer was harder. Because this time, what Mom was threatening to destroy was not fabric. It was the last version of my wedding I had still been trying to save. What do you want to do? Mark asked. The question sat between us longer than Mom's message deserved. A week earlier, I would have started bargaining with myself before I ever called her. Maybe I could take 1 Saturday after the honeymoon. Maybe Dad would only need me for a few hours. Maybe if I promised enough, Mom would come. The cost would sound small because that was how the system worked. No one ever asked for my whole life at once. They asked for an afternoon, a weekend, an appointment, one more favor. Then they built permanence out of pieces. I'm going to call her once, I said. Mark nodded. And if she says no, then she says no. Saying it was easier than believing it. Mom answered almost immediately. So you got my message? Yes. Good. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who assumed the next step was negotiation. I sat on the edge of the bed. You're invited to my wedding. That's not what your behavior says. You're invited under the same basic expectation I have for every guest. A sharp breath came through the phone. I am not a guest. I'm your mother. Then come as my mother. What is that supposed to mean? It means you don't use Emily to tell me I shouldn't be happy. You don't bring up Dad's care during the wedding. You don't ask me to cancel or shorten the honeymoon. And you don't make commitments for me. Natalie, that's what I'm asking. Those are rules. Yes. Mothers shouldn't need rules. The old version of me would have rushed to soften it. They aren't really rules. I'm not trying to punish you. Please don't take this the wrong way. Instead, I looked at the half-packed suitcase on the floor. Then come as my mother, not my scheduler. She didn't answer for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had flattened. If I have to ask permission to be your mother, I won't come. That isn't what I said. It's what you meant. No. I meant what I said. You're choosing paperwork and boundaries over your own mother. No. I'm choosing not to trade access to my life for your attendance. You'll regret this. Maybe I would. That was the hardest part. Boundaries did not come with guarantees that I would feel good afterward. They only made the choice mine. The invitation still stands, I said. If you can respect those things, come. I won't be treated like a stranger. She ended the call. For several seconds, the phone remained against my ear, even though the line was dead. Then I lowered it. Mark was sitting across from me. She's not coming, I said. He didn't tell me it was her loss. He didn't say she didn't deserve to be there. He just asked, "Do you want me to sit here?" Yes. So he did. That was the whole rescue. Someone staying without taking over. 2 days later, Emily asked if she could come by. She arrived carrying coffee and looking like she had rehearsed something in the car. We sat at my kitchen table. For a while, neither of us mentioned Mom. Then Emily wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm coming to the wedding." "Okay, Mom says I shouldn't." That surprised me enough that I looked up. "What did she tell you?" "That if I go, I'm taking your side." "Do you think you are?" Emily looked down. "I think I'm going to my sister's wedding." It was not a grand declaration. That made me trust it more. A few moments passed before she continued. "I need to tell you something." I waited. "You were right about some of the things Mom asked you to do for me." "Some." Her mouth tightened. "I'm trying, Natalie." "Okay." She stared into the coffee. "I knew she was calling you a lot. That was not news. I knew she asked you to drive me places, change plans, stay over. Did you know about the coast trip?" "Yes." The answer hurt more because it came without a fight. "Why didn't you say anything?" Emily rubbed one thumb against the cardboard sleeve around her cup. "Because it was easier." The same answer she had given me before. This time, she didn't hide behind Mom. It was easier when somebody else arranged everything. I didn't have to ask people and risk them saying no. There it was. The thing I had been learning from the other side. A real request included the possibility of refusal. Mom's system removed that risk for Emily. It also removed my choice. "You let me pay for that convenience," I said. "Yes." Her eyes lifted to mine. "I'm sorry for that. Not for everything. Not an apology broad enough to erase years. For that, I could work with something specific." "What happens next?" I asked. "I don't know." "Neither do I." Emily gave a weak smile. "Claire went with me to the appointment." "I know. I called her again last week." "That was new." "How did that go?" "We got lunch." She picked at the cup sleeve. "Mom asked why I was bothering Claire when you already know all my medical stuff." My shoulders tightened. "What did you say?" "That you weren't available." The word struck me. Not selfish. Not angry. Unavailable. "And Claire was?" "Yes." Emily looked almost embarrassed. "So I asked her." That was all. No transformation. No sudden confidence. Just necessity producing a different habit. She told me she had also looked up the support group again. "Did you go?" "Not yet." "Okay. Mom thinks it's a bad idea." "What do you think?" Emily let out a long breath. "I think I might try one meeting." That was enough. Not redemption. Movement. Before she left, we agreed on something simple. If she needed help, she would ask me herself. If I said no, she would not send Mom back to renegotiate. And if Mom told either of us what the other one needed, we would verify it directly. The agreement felt almost embarrassingly basic. Two adult sisters promising to speak to each other. But basic things become revolutionary in a house built on intermediaries. Dad tested the new arrangement next. He had been home for several days when he called. The paid aide was helping in the mornings, and home health visits had started. From what he told me, the bills were arriving too. Mom had already mentioned them twice. Dad didn't. He simply said, "Are you free Thursday afternoon?" I checked my calendar. "No." "Okay." The word came faster this time. Then he added, "I'll call the agency." I leaned against the counter. "Thanks for asking me." He made a small sound. "Still getting used to it." "So am I." He didn't apologize for the fire. He didn't suddenly understand 6 years of labor, but he called the agency. That mattered more to me than another vague speech about how things would be different, because different had finally become an action. The wedding morning arrived under a pale Portland sky. For the first hour, everything was ordinary. Hairpins, coffee, someone looking for scissors, Dana complaining that the hotel room had terrible lighting, Emily arriving early because she had apparently been awake since 5. Dad came with his cane and moved more slowly than he had before surgery, but he came. Mom did not. Her absence hurt exactly as much as I had feared. There was no clever boundary that could make it painless. While I was getting dressed, my eyes kept moving toward the door every time footsteps passed in the hallway. At one point, Emily noticed. "She's not here," she said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry." "Me too." That was all we said. The replacement dress fit beautifully. It did not look like the first dress. That mattered less than I thought it would. No long train. No covered buttons. No memory of Mom storing it in her house. The dress belonged entirely to the day I was actually having. Before we left the bridal suite, I picked up my phone. Mom's name was not on the screen. Yet, for a moment, I considered leaving the phone with Mark. Then I stopped. He did not need to become the gatekeeper between me and my mother. That was still my job. The bridal suite had a small locking drawer beneath the vanity. I turned the phone completely off, placed it inside, and locked it. Emily watched me. "What if something happens? Dad is here. You're here. Everyone who needs to reach me before the ceremony is in this building." She nodded. No argument. That small response made me unexpectedly emotional. For years, an unanswered phone had felt irresponsible. That morning, it felt intentional. The ceremony began without interruption. Mark was waiting at the front. Dad walked beside me for part of the aisle, then stopped where we had agreed because the distance was difficult for his hip. No one improvised a speech. No one turned my wedding into a public reckoning. When Mark took my hand, he whispered, "You okay?" I looked around. Emily was there. Dana was there. Dad had made it. Mom had chosen not to. The grief came with me anyway, but it did not get to officiate. "Yes," I whispered. And for once, yes meant exactly what I intended it to mean. Hours later, after dinner and photographs and more dancing than Dad's physical therapist would probably have approved of, I went back upstairs. The phone was still in the drawer, exactly where I had left it. When I turned it on, several notifications appeared. 3 missed calls from Mom. 1 voicemail. All during the ceremony window. My thumb hovered over the voicemail icon. For a second, curiosity pulled hard. Maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe she had wanted to apologize. Maybe she had called because Dad's aid had canceled. Maybe nothing urgent had happened at all. I didn't know. And because I didn't know, I didn't turn a guess into fact. The only thing I could see was that she had tried to reach me during a period when I had deliberately made myself unavailable. That was enough information for that night. I locked the phone again and went back downstairs. The voicemail waited until the next morning. It was less dramatic than my imagination had made it. Mom said she hoped I was happy with my choices, that she could not believe I had gone through with the wedding without her, and that Dad's care schedule for the following week still needed attention. Even then, wedding, guilt, caregiving, all in one message. I deleted it after listening once. 3 months later, the care calendar looked completely different. Dad still needed help, though much less than he had right after surgery. Some mornings had an aide listed. Physical therapy had its own blocks. Emily had added a few visits herself. My name appeared too, but only where I had placed it. A Tuesday dinner. 1 ride to a follow-up that Dad had asked for directly. A Sunday afternoon I had offered because Mark was out and I wanted to see Dad. No standing weekends. No assumed coverage. Mom hated the new system. I knew because she told me. She still tried to bypass it. One Sunday morning, a message appeared. "Emily needs you today. She's having a rough time." My first instinct was still to grab my keys. That surprised me. 3 months was not enough to erase 41 years of conditioning. Instead, I opened Emily's contact. "Do you need me today?" Her answer came a few minutes later. "No, Mom decided that. I'm meeting Claire later." I stared at the message. Then another one appeared. "I went to the support group last week. Not sure I liked it. A small smile came before I could stop it. You don't have to like it. Exactly. That was the most Emily thing she had said in months. Mom's original message remained unanswered. The world did not end. Susan still believed she knew what other people needed. The difference was that knowing no longer gave her authority over my calendar. Dad's invoices continued coming too. He mentioned them once over dinner. Those aides aren't cheap. No. He cut his chicken. Your mother nearly fell over when she saw the first month. I didn't speculate about what Mom felt. Dad had told me only what he had seen. Are you managing it? Yes. He paused. We had to move some things around. That was the consequence. Not homelessness. Not financial ruin. Not a miraculous downfall. They had to move things around. For years, I had been the thing that moved. My PTO moved. My dates moved. My weekends moved. My happiness moved. Now the budget moved instead. The check for the dress had cleared long before the wedding. One afternoon, while organizing a cabinet, I found the folder containing the original receipt and the photographs from the fire pit. $4,200. Blackened fabric. Orange flame. The images still made my stomach tighten, but they no longer felt like unfinished business. Mom had destroyed property that belonged to me. I had documented it, named the cost, requested reimbursement, received it. That did not buy forgiveness. It did not restore trust. It also did not need to become a weapon I carried into every future conversation. I closed the folder and placed it in the back of the cabinet, not erased. Stored. There was a difference. A few weeks after the wedding, Mark and I had gone to finish one last piece of paperwork, the marriage certificate. The clerk placed it in front of us and indicated where each signature belonged. My attention caught on the blank line for my name. For most people, it was probably just a line. To me, it looked strangely enormous. Over the previous months, my name had appeared in places before my permission did. Care schedules, assumptions, plans, conversations where someone else had announced what Natalie would handle. Someone had always been ready to explain what my silence meant. No one did that in the clerk's office. Mark signed his line. Then the pen came to me. No one rushed me. No one said I always did this. No one reminded me who needed me more. The choice had already been made because I had made it. I signed, Natalie Brooks. My handwriting looked exactly the way it always had. The meaning did not. Later that afternoon, my phone calendar opened while I was checking the week ahead. Appointments. Work. Dinner with Emily. A follow-up Dad had arranged for himself. Then, Saturday. Nothing. For years, an empty Saturday had looked like space, waiting for somebody else's emergency. Now it was simply Saturday. I left it blank. For most of my life, my family treated my silence like a signature. I finally learned that my name belonged only on the life I had actually chosen.